Now I'm going to introduce our theme, how PV can help with housing crisis by keeping PV PV. Our featured speaker is Jonathan Zasloff, professor of law at UCLA School of Law. Professor Zasloff is an expert in environmental and property law, and he's also an ordained rabbi who teaches both undergraduate level and law school courses on Jewish religion and thought systems. The first time Professor Zasloff spoke to our club was February 2017. This was and he was speaking about the Israeli ambassador who was nominated by Trump, David Freeman, a bankruptcy lawyer who represented Trump's businesses. And that qualified him to be ambassador. We have a nice write-up about that meeting in our newsletter, which we'll probably put a link to in our upcoming newsletter. But also 2 years ago, just at this time in November, Professor Zasloff spoke to us on solving the housing crisis in California, and that's why we're calling him back. At that time, he was speaking to us after SB 9 and SB 10 had been signed by Governor Newsom. SB 9 allowed the creation of the accessory dwelling units, ADUs, if they met certain local requirements. And SB 10 allowed local cities to zone for developments of up to 10 residential units if located near transit hubs. Both bills pitted housing activists against anti-development activists. And interestingly, ADUs are now being embraced by local cities to meet their required housing element plan to the state. And a plan is required by the California Department of Housing and Community Development since 1969 to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community. This past week, you might know, city leaders from across the country have arrived in Los Angeles for a 2-day U.S. conference of mayors to coordinate a national strategy to combat the homelessness and housing insecurity crisis. And this is being hosted by Mayor Bass. Today's discussion will address the reasons for the housing shortage and how we can be part of the solution and keep PV PV. So please welcome Jonathan Zasloff.
Thanks so much for that, Ann. I'm going to be talking about some of these things today. I don't even remember that I spoke specifically about the ambassador to Israel back in 2017. That was, my Lord, that's nearly 7 years ago. I've tried to repress most of the Trump presidency, but I suppose we can't at this point. Okay, so let me now see if I can share my screen. Okay, good. And then I can start. I know I'm screen sharing.
We can see it, screen share.
You can see it from the beginning. I just want to, here we go.
Yeah, there you go.
And then do you see all of you over on the right?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so I'm just going to try to put it here so you can see more things. Okay, so here's where we are, and I'm just going to talk a little bit today about the housing elements and how they work, with some specific references to Rancho Palos Verdes. I tried to make it a little bit more local for you. I am not an expert in the specifics of the Palos Verdes Peninsula, so maybe we can have a good discussion about that. So I'll start off talking a little bit about housing elements in the city of Los Angeles. I'll talk specifically about Rancho Palos Verdes, because of the 4 cities that in the peninsula, RPV is the biggest, at least as far as I can tell. So I did a little bit of work on that. Talk a little bit about various housing forms that may be useful, and then talk a little bit about homelessness and what causes it and what doesn't cause it. And I think you'll find that it's linked. See, this is why I can't, I'm so bad at this. Okay. So, the city of Los Angeles is kind of, ground zero, for housing crisis. This isn't specifically about homelessness, but, you're talking about a median rent of nearly $3,000, or more than $3,000 for a 2-bedroom. This is in the city of Los Angeles. And then when you're talking about the median household income being about $70,000, that means that the median person in Los Angeles is rent stressed, because you're rent stressed if you're paying more than 30% of your income on housing. And so most people who are working class, middle class people, remember $70,000, that's middle class. And it's why we're the fourth most expensive city in the world. And you can see the economists' discussion here. You know, we've essentially welcomed more people than without adding places for them to live. And that's one of the things that's going on. And if you can see just about how difficult this is, just in terms of to be middle class, if you're middle class in Los Angeles, to be able to afford housing, you got to make $165,000 a year, which is, as my Aunt Ellen was fond of saying, that'll buy you a nice little roast. $165,000 a year is still a very pretty high family income, and you can see the median house price. It's nearly $1 million. And that means that we have, the percentage of families, this is again in the city of Los Angeles, who are rent burdened. It's a very, very, very large problem that is going on. The as Anne mentioned, the idea is that you're supposed to have a housing element that tells the state, this is how we're going to respond to this. It's supposed to be prepared every 8 years. Anne is right when she says that this has been the case since 1969, but for more than 4 decades, most cities essentially didn't even take it very seriously. One of the things that is the case, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it was very common for cities to say, oh, here are all the sites that we have that can accommodate housing. And a lot of times they were already fully developed, but they just assumed that nobody would check. I found this, I live in Pacific Palisades, looking in my area, which of course is not its own city, but I'd found that some of the sites that they said, one was like a dirt road that was overlooking a very steep ledge. Was one of the things that the city of Los Angeles said would be part of their housing elements. Other parts of it were things that, already are fully developed. And it's supposed to say what a city is going to do to plan for its needs of its residents. And the key thing about this is this so-called RHNA number, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, for all of this. Now, for Los Angeles, big city, of course, Los Angeles has to create nearly 450,000 new housing units, which means that now they say that they've already got a potential to be able to fill this of 230,000, but that means it's going to have to rezone more than 250,000 for more than 250,000 units in Los Angeles. And that's what happens when when virtually all of the city, although that's changing now, is zoned for single family houses. And so the city of Los Angeles is a very, very, very formidable challenge in this case. Rancho Palos Verdes, it will not surprise all of you, is much smaller. And according to the housing element, according to the RHNA number that Los Angeles, that RPV got from the Southern California Association of Governments, RPV has to plan for adding 639 units over the next 8 years. This is what the housing element of Rancho Palos Verdes breaks it down as, although there is a problem with that housing element, as we'll see, but this is where they say what this is. AMI means area median income. So above moderate is 120% or more than area median income, moderate, low income, and very low, as you can see. As to what they have to plan for. It doesn't mean that they actually have to create them. It means that they have to plan for them, and then to see if developers want to actually do that. So they have to make it available for developers to build these units, but the city can't build the units. I don't think we want the city actually building the units themselves. Here, though, is the big problem in Rancho Palos Verdes, is that so far the State Department of Housing and Community Development has not approved its housing element. It's difficult getting things. This is from last year. I'll talk about the most recent communication I've seen, is that basically housing, the HCD has said that the housing element that RPV has submitted is not adequate. It's not doing the things that it needs to do to have a compliant housing element. It's not doing enough. And we're still the last, the last formal one was in May. But you still say that there are all these revisions that still need to be compliant. And what that means is, since the housing element, a compliant housing element was due on October 15th, 2021, and they have a year to get it done, and they didn't get it done. And so RPV is now out of compliance. And that can create a lot of risk for the city. I suspect that Rolling Hills and Rolling Hills Estates are also out of compliance, but they're, at least in terms of population, as far as I can tell, are much smaller. And so I'm focused on RPV now. This is the best that I can do in terms of local knowledge. And here are the problems that this presents for Rancho Palos Verdes. That this is the most recent communication that I have seen. This is from May. And this is all available on the Housing and Community Development Department website. No magic here. The first thing is, you can see at the first bullet point is that if the city is out of compliance, that they can be sued, certainly by the Attorney General, and getting fined for it. So far, they have not been. The department has said, well, we're not ready to refer you to the Attorney General yet, but it's a matter of time, at least as far as I can tell, about what could happen to the city. And the other thing is, and this is very important for people who are concerned about development, if you do not have a compliant housing element, if somebody comes to the city for a project that has at least 20% low income, very low, or certainly very low or low income, the city is not allowed to deny it on the grounds that it doesn't comply with the zoning. So essentially, under this law, the Housing Accountability Act, which has been around for a while, but only recently has had teeth put into it and was kind of discovered to have teeth put into it. This means that if a developer comes in and says, guess what, I want to put in a 100-unit development with 20% low income, the city can't say, well, you can't do that because it's not zoned for that. That's not legal. That opens up the city to this kind of risk. This is called the builder's remedy. And some of you may have heard of this. If you don't have a compliant housing element, you are subject to a builder's remedy. And this could be a real issue. Here are some problems that HCD identified. The city had not identified a good inventory of land. Many of the sites that are identified are already developed. That's not necessarily illegal, as I say here. But you got to say, okay, it's already developed, but this is how we think that it can still fit more housing, which they didn't do. It says that so this is a direct quote from the letter saying, well, you've got all these permit and this approvals process that can be a constraint, but then you got to tell us, and this is a constraint, and this is how we're going to change this process. And they didn't say that. And they don't have any programs to assist in the development of low, very low, and extremely low income housing, which could be an inclusionary ordinance or other things. And they didn't do that. I think that it's important to keep in mind, and I think I have it down here at the bottom of the slide, maybe not. I'm not casting any aspersions on the city, and particularly not casting any aspersions on the city staff. They're overworked and underpaid, and they probably have few political incentives to get this done. But it's a problem. And I suspect that similar kinds of issues are existing in Rolling Hills and Rolling Hills Estates for this. So what is to be done? Well, the first thing, let's take a look at a few things. This is a chart from HCD that says, okay, what do we mean by low income, very low income, extremely low income? This is if you have, I'm sorry to be giving all this data here. If you think about this, if you go across, can people see my cursor? I'm doing my cursor. People can see the cursor. This is how many people are in a family. So here's a family of 4. This is what it means. If you are very low income, that means a family of 4 makes $63,000. Right now, that may be something of a surprise, because when we think of very low income, we think, oh my God, these are people with no income at all. Not true. If we think of people like essential workers, during COVID, when we had the terrible problems and grocery store workers were, delivering us all of our food, that's basically, if you had a family of four with two grocery store workers, they're very low income. Low income now, and this says something about just how expensive Los Angeles, how expensive Los Angeles is low income is a family of four making up to $100,000. Now, here's a weird thing about Los Angeles, and I had to look twice at this and call people and find out about this. Because low income is supposed to be 50 to 80% of median income. Now, I'm not a math whiz. I'm a lawyer, which means that that's why I went to law school. I can't add and I can't stand the sight of blood. But even I can say that if low income is supposed to be 80% of the median income, which is 98,000, 80% of 98,000 is not 100,000. I don't care what kind of mathematician you are. It's not that. What in the world is going on? Housing is so expensive throughout Los Angeles County that essentially, and this is true with a couple of other counties in the state, housing itself is so expensive that HCD made an adjustment. So a low income family of four can be $100,000 a year. So this is not the projects we're talking about here. Right. Now, here's the problem as far as I can say about what's happening in RPV. I have read chunks of the housing element. I have not carefully gone over every single thing. I've tried to read some of the council proceedings in this. And why is this a problem? Well, one is that the RPV is talking about that they want to use a lot of ADUs. There was a bill passed a few years ago that makes ADUs basically by right. It wasn't SB 9. That's a different bill. But they acknowledge in the housing element, we still have a pretty restrictive ordinance. Now, they updated it last year. But it's still a pretty restrictive ordinance. And so it's not clear that they're doing as much as they can to make it easy for people to build ADUs. And that's going to be really important, because if you're short enough land, you got to use the land. It's not as if RPV or Palos Verdes in general has just, massive amounts of free land out there available to build more housing on. It's a real problem. So you got to use the land that you have more. SB 9, Ann mentioned, that's the bill that, a lot of people get very upset about this. But what it does is it basically says, as a matter of right, somebody can split their lot and turn their single family home into a duplex. That can be a way of creating a whole lot more housing, again, without making huge skyscrapers, anything else on that. But the entire housing element, and as far as I can tell for the last 2.5 years, they haven't even mentioned anything about SB 9. 350 page housing element only has one reference to SB 9, which is a couple who I think are very active in Palos Verdes. You guys will know, not me. A couple whose last name are the Sattlers. I don't know if they're a famous or infamous family of some kind, but the husband and wife wrote and said, hey, you haven't mentioned anything about SB 9. And they still haven't. One of my personal favorite ones is, all right, you have parking lots. Are there parking lots, either city-owned, publicly owned, or even privately owned parking lots? Sometimes you can build housing over them. No mention of that. And I think that's a real opportunity that has been missed. No inclusionary requirements. What are we going to do to have very low-income units, especially because land is so expensive? No mention of it in the housing element. And then, of course, there's this whole issue with Marymount College, which you guys have forgotten more about than I'm going to know. I teach at UCLA. I have no idea what the university is going to do down there. I'm not sure that the university knows what they're going to do down there. But that could be an opportunity. The only references I really saw in the housing element were people writing in saying, you shouldn't do anything about Marymount College and you shouldn't build a single housing unit there. That makes it a little difficult. Again, I don't want to be casting aspersions on the staff. They've under very high pressure conditions, they're doing the best that they can, and I don't want to criticize them. But these are some gaps that could be available. And so the question, where are these things going to go? One is the way to have the missing middle, duplexes, ADUs, et cetera, and is there land that's underused? So what I want to do is I want to, last a few minutes, I want to just give you some pictures, because when you say things like duplexes, people just go insane for reasons that I personally can't quite understand. So I figured I'd just show you a few pictures. Again, not a genius with this. I'm probably violating a whole lot of copyright here, but since this is for educational purposes, it's fair use. Here's a duplex that's in Berkeley. I think it's all right. To me, that does not scare me as a owner and in a single family neighborhood myself. I do not object to this. It's a very familiar housing form. Here's something from New England. You can tell that it's New England because there's snow. Again, looks in many ways like a single family house. These are all duplexes, and ways in which this can be set up. Here's another one from East Coast. You can tell it's got wood in it, with all of this stuff. When I think duplexes, I think of Crescent Heights Boulevard in Los Angeles. I don't know how many of you have spent time around Crescent Heights, Carthay Circle. This is what they look like. These are all duplexes. These are all kind of, middle-class housing. The nice Spanish tile roofs, not clear how expensive that would be, but, it's even stucco on the side. Here's another one. And again, this is for the multiple listing service. This is what the realtors are saying. That's a duplex. You got one unit on the top, one unit on the bottom. These are not. Here's another one. I got a friend who lives in one of these on the first floor. I don't think of these, and people can have their own opinions as to is this the kind of housing stock that's going to destroy Palos Verdes? To my mind, it doesn't, but other people can say what they think. Here's another one. I love this picture. They really got it on a great day, but they actually look like this. And it's kind of funny because people say, well, if you put in duplexes, that's the Manhattanization of Los Angeles. Manhattan is not known as a city of duplexes, right? That's Manhattan. That is a duplex. They are two different things. So we have that. This is my favorite one, is the notion of apartments over parking lots. And this is in Sherman Oaks. I used to live a block away from here. This was developed by an outfit called Menorah Housing, which is an agency as part of the Jewish Federation. I lived a block from this, so even though this is not my picture, because it would be all blurry if it were my picture, it looks like this. So you have the parking on the bottom, and then you've got the apartments on the top. Those are all affordable units. And here's another one. This is the way it looks on the side. This is near Cedros and Ventura, near Sherman Oaks Village. So if those of you who who want to do the long journey from Palos Verdes to Sherman Oaks, you might have to stop and get a hotel room on the way, but that's what it looks like. And I think this is a really underused opportunity to be building housing stock over parking lots. That can be doing things and not destroying the nature of a neighborhood. I think that's really important. And here are some other affordable units. This is in Menlo Park. This is an apartment building. Not sure you got the see how the room looks like that. Again, this is all affordable. These are all affordable units. We hear affordable housing and we think about the projects like Robert Taylor Homes or Pruitt-Igoe. Nobody has built things like that in about 60 years. And thank God for that. They're building things like this. This is Panorama City. It's called Montecito Terraces. I think most people would rather live in Montecito than Panorama City, but if you have to live in Panorama City, it's probably better to live in Montecito Terraces. This is in Marina Del Rey. This is the Redwood Village Apartments. This is developed by Tom Safran. This is in Mar Vista, Marina Del Rey. He's got units in Torrance that are a little bit more intense. This is what it looks like. There's nothing, at least to my mind, scary about this. This is all affordable housing. This is all Section 8 housing for that. So what about homelessness? I'll just finish on this. Good question. How is any of this going to have to do with homelessness? They're two different issues in terms of affordability and homelessness, but they're very, very closely linked. And that's because homelessness is a housing problem. And I thought I'd show you some data from a book that came out last year with the unremarkable title of Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Because it really is. And these are some graphs and some data. This is what you get when you have a professor. But here's how it goes. Okay, so it's basically about rent. So what is this graph telling us? This is graphing the amount of homelessness you have against the vacancy rate. So the smaller the vacancy rate is, the greater the amount of homelessness is. And this is a regression, which is a fancy term for a kind of equation that tries to take away all the confounding variables. And it puts the per capita point in time counts. PIT stands for point in time. When people go out and they make, they do their homeless count, that's what we're talking about here. And what this says is basically the higher the vacancy rate is, the lower homelessness goes down, or the more homelessness goes down. If we could get right now the vacancy rate in Los Angeles, I think, is somewhere around 3%. If we get the vacancy rate down to 12%, homelessness problem goes way, way down. This is in cities. This is a comparison of different cities. See, each one of these dots is a city, and each one of these dots is a county. And you can see it's a pretty tight relationship here between the more you can get the vacancy rate up, the more you can get the homelessness rate down. And that's vacancy generally. It's not just vacancy for very low income units. And the reason for that is pretty intuitive. So I was interviewing somebody a few months ago who was a homeless person who had gotten a job at an outfit called Chrysalis that some of you may have heard of. And I said, "So how'd you become homeless?" She said, "It was pretty easy. I got kicked out of my room." I was like, "Why? Why'd you get kicked out of your room?" She said, "Well, I was living in a room, and the family's son got kicked out of his apartment. So he came and lived in the room. So I got kicked out of the room." Well, why did he get kicked out of the apartment? Because somebody else wanted to move into his apartment and bid up the price. So what happens is when the overall vacancy rate goes down, people start losing their apartments. They go into other rooms, and that pushes people into homelessness. So that's one of the first things that creates homelessness is a low vacancy rate. Here's the I'm not sure that I got. Wait, no. Okay, I missed something here. The other big one, I forgot that slide, has to do with average median rent. The higher rents go, the more you get homelessness, even though median rent, homeless people aren't paying the median rent. It's regular people that are paying the median rent. But as that median rent goes up, you get a huge increase in homelessness. Note what it is not about. It is not about mental illness, right? People think of homelessness as a mental illness problem. Not really. You don't have very much of a relationship there. You can't find cities and counties that have higher rates of mental illness do not have higher rates of homelessness. And cities that have lower rates of mental illness do not have lower rates of homelessness. It's not correlated because lots of cities have, people with mental illness. I hate to put it this way, but, here's an example of a city that has a very low homelessness rate, Detroit. Detroit has a very low homelessness rate. I think you got to be a little crazy to live in Detroit, but it's not the reason why, but that doesn't affect what their homelessness rate is. It's not about poverty either, right? Again, if you see, there's not much of a relationship. The R squared here, which is the relationship of this, it's not nearly as strong as you'd think. And in fact, if you think about cities or states in the country that are very, very poor, they have low homelessness rates. The state with the lowest homelessness rate is Mississippi, which is a very, very poor state. It's not about that. Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia have low homelessness rates. It's the combination of a vigorous economy and a refusal to build that creates a homelessness problem. And it's not a surprise that the cities in the country that have the highest homeless rate are places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Washington, D.C., all very vigorous economies, Lots of people are moving to them. Lots of people are working there. They're just not building houses. That's what creates homelessness. It's not even drug use. There's a little bit, but there isn't much of a correlation between higher rates of drug use and homelessness, at least between cities. Some cities have much lower drug use. Some cities have much higher drug use. It doesn't affect their homelessness rate. It's not about that. Lots of reasons to get rid of mental illness, lots of reasons to get rid of poverty, lots of reasons to get rid of illicit drug use. But homelessness isn't the reason for it. It also isn't even the weather. Take a look at the places in the country. If you take a look at these two maps, the places with the highest rates of homelessness: California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii. Those are not places where you can see. Washington's a pretty cold state. New York is a pretty cold state. Vermont is a pretty cold state. Massachusetts is a pretty cold state. Whereas if you've got a lot of hot states like Texas, Florida, Arizona, it's not about the weather. It's about whether you're building. And Texas builds a lot. It's one of the few things that Texas does well. So at the end of the day, you got to build. Houston just permits a lot more units than Los Angeles does, and it permits a whole lot more units than New York City does. And it's not a surprise. Houston has a lower homelessness problem. Does that mean there are no homeless people in Houston? Of course not. There are going to be homeless people anywhere. That's when you're talking about the hardcore. 1/3 of homeless people, have serious mental illness. Those are the hardcore. But the spikes that we've been getting over the last several years have been the combination of vigorous economies and refusal to build. And there are better ways to build. And that's one of the things why I'm talking about this. There are better ways to build than just say, okay, well, we'll plop a huge building somewhere. And I think, and particularly when you have a shortage of land, a shortage of buildable land, looking at things like more ADUs, having a more a less regulated environment for ADUs, encouraging duplexes more, encouraging parking over parking lots. I think encouraging acute housing over parking lots, encouraging the use of public land. That's the kind of thing that I think could do it. But again, you guys have forgotten more about the various policies than I'm ever going to know. And so that's what it is. And so I'm done. There it is.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Before, there are a few questions in chat, but I have one question that came in before the meeting that I'd like to ask first before the ones on chat, and then and entertain others. And the question was, he was confused. He's a longtime member of our club, and he's just very confused on the housing element. And I guess the bottom
as are
line,
we all.
as you were showing, right?
Yeah.
And so bottom line, though, what they really want to know is how does it pertain to the value of their house and the character of their community?
Okay. The at some level, now I'm going to tell you the bad news. I'll start with the bad news and go to the good news. At some level, because I have to be honest, which is why I probably shouldn't be a politician. The more housing that is built, if we want to get housing prices down, if we want to get rental prices down, if we want to make housing more affordable, that means that at some level, people's housing prices are going to have to go down or at least stabilize. I perhaps one of the few times that I've ever made a good decision, and it was a pure accident. My wife and I bought our house in 2010, which was at the bottom of the market. It was purely accidental because my daughter was 6 years old at the time, and so we wanted to move here to get into good schools. Total and complete luck. But since that time, my house has gone up by 2.5 times. So it's great to do that. But at some point or another, it's going to have to affect our housing prices, that they will at least stabilize a little bit, a lot, and maybe even go down a little bit, because the whole point is, if you build more housing, not as many people are going to be bidding for your houses. That doesn't mean that you're going to be underwater. What it means is you may not make 250% in 13 years. In terms of the community, the question is, it's not exactly sure, since you're referring to it, Anne, I'm not exactly sure, but I would say in terms of the community, if you're talking about the built form, that's the reason why I'm focusing so much on things like ADUs and duplexes and building over parking lots and those kinds of things. Because in many circumstances, after all of this, you can't even tell the difference. And it's not a surprise that a few years ago when SB 9 came in, I mean, it hasn't been used that much because of really huge resistance from the part of a lot of local governments. SB 9 came in, everybody said, oh my God, this would be a huge disaster. It really hasn't been. I mean, my next door neighbors are building a duplex. It annoys me with the sanding, with the tile sander or the tile saw, but that's a temporary thing. So I don't think in terms of built form, I think there are a lot of ways in which you can have, I hate to say this, but I will, because you guys have been so good about this. You can have a little more density, like a duplex or an ADU, and you can't even tell the difference. Now, the other issue with the community, and I'm going to try to read into this, but you tell me if you think I'm wrong, is, people who are worried about, like, well, if we have low income housing, is that going to increase things like crime? And I suppose what I'm arguing and why I tried to show you that graph that shows low income, very low income, those are people making between $60,000 and $100,000 a year. $60,000 and $100,000 a year, is not a professional criminal or drug addict. It's a working class family. And so, if I think about I mean, a lot of ways there are workforce housing. Teachers, assistants, grocery store clerks, secretaries, vocational nurses, police officers, firefighters. I was talking the other day with Allison Holdorf Polhill, who's the person here who works at the LAUSD, and she said they're having a hard time finding teachers' assistants for our local schools because they live so far away. And I said, well, why can't they drive in? She said they can't afford the gasoline. So there's a huge problem with that, and I at least as far as I'm concerned, I think that actually helps the community to have more grocery store clerks and teachers assistants and police officers and firefighters. It's also good for the environment, by the way. This happens a lot. We don't build any housing in Los Angeles. We don't build any housing here. So people buy houses out in Lancaster, and then you wonder why the 405 is so crowded. Right. So I don't know if that's responsive.
No, that is very responsive. Yeah. And I agree. We have one before we get to Ronson, who's raised his hand. Mayron, do you want to ask your question that you put on chat?
Yes, thank you. Very good for a very good and clear presentation, Jonathan. My question is regarding the excess capacity of office space buildings. These are buildings that are already present in a lot of locations. So my intuition is that there will be less resistance from the residents nearby in opposing them because they're already there. But is it economically feasible to convert them? And would they meet the state's requirement?
Well, unfortunately enough, it's a very good idea. It's an excellent idea, and I think it's going to happen. I think it will happen. In fact, there was a piece of legislation passed last year that said at least in areas of high that are close to transit, automatically residential is a permitted use in a commercial zone. So a developer, if he or she wanted to, could change their commercial units over to a residential unit. The question would be whether that pencils out for a developer. My suspicion is that it probably doesn't. On the other hand, if the developer is having a hard time filling those slots, if the developer is having a hard time getting rents in those areas, the developer might be able to go to and say, look, I got to get some, I need a cash flow here. Whether the investors, if it's a bank, would the bank want that? The bank might be in the position of saying, no, we're going to foreclose on your loan, in which case the developer might say, fine, foreclose it, take the building. Now you got to figure it out. So I think that if they did transition to affordable residential units, and they could show that this would actually happen, I think that would clearly meet the state requirements under the housing element. I'm looking at your second provision. The real issue is whether, at some point, they're going to start doing some changes. And at this point, it may be a big negotiation about who's going to have to take what size of a haircut. But I think that at this point, given what developers' expectations are, it's not economically feasible. But if they can't rent the place out for another 2 years, I think it could be economically feasible. And there may be ways in which you can combine and do a mixed use aspect of this. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that happens. That's a good question. I hope, again, I say this all the time to my students. I hope that's responsive.
Thank you. Okay, Ronson.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for this presentation. I work for the Southeast Cities Council of Governments.
Okay. So you're on the front lines of this.
Exactly.
Everybody sits there and yells and screams at you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been pretty positive because we're doing a lot of stuff on homelessness, and that's kind of what my sandbox. And I work with all 15 cities in the South Bay to address the homelessness issue. And I just want to underscore kind of the stuff that you were saying about Ranchos Palos Verdes. People, may not know this, and it's probably not talked about enough when we talk about housing element. Is that there are real people that need this, and in Rancho Palos Verdes, we have this apartment complex where there is at least half a dozen seniors whose Social Security income can no longer pay rent. They're making $1,800 a month in Social Security income, and their rent's north of that. Wow. And so, these seniors have been living in RPV for over 50 years. They're like 70, 80 years old. One of the most common questions I get is like, I work hard to live in where I live, where it's Manhattan Beach, Pacific Palisades, RPV, what have you. Why should we build more housing to help the low-income folks? Or why can't people just move somewhere cheaper like Texas? And, it's really hard to move an 80-year-old who's been living in RPV for 50 years to Texas. And people they don't think about that stuff. And so I'm really glad you're shining a light on this. And it really starts with constituents. You need to tell your electeds, your city managers, that there are people struggling in your communities, and they need help. And it's one of the most common calls we get in our office are seniors right now who can no longer pay rent.
Wow. And what you said at the last is so important, is to getting in touch with electeds and people like that, because the people who don't like something, they will always show up at the meeting. They will always show up at the meeting. Whereas it's rarer for people who say, no, actually, we should figure out a better way to do this. They don't show up at the meeting as much. Although that's incredibly important, and again, you can't move an 80-year-old to Texas. And note the other things, right? When Toyota left Torrance and moved to Texas, one of the reasons why is their people couldn't get housing. So it's going to affect everybody. It's going to affect everybody. It's going to be very, very, very hard. So I appreciate what you're saying. Wow, having the seniors, we don't want to, it's good to have people's grandparents around.
Yes. Okay, Connie.
So I have a question and a comment. I'll do the comment first. My son lives in Houston, and the reason they can build housing is they have zero zoning in Houston.
Right.
Zero.
That's right.
And it shows, by the way. Anyway, and then when you were talking about Rancho Palos Verdes, you said something about we don't want the city building housing. And why not? And I think it was Ronson, actually. I heard him speak someplace. I think he's the one that mentioned that Paris, 30% of the housing is public housing built by the government. So I'm wondering why you would just reject that out of hand.
I wouldn't reject it out of hand. It might be a little bit more difficult for the city getting financing. I don't reject the idea of the city doing that itself. I think there also might be a budgetary issue.
Yeah.
The way that most housing gets built, most affordable housing gets built now is through nonprofits, community development corporations. So that's the affordable stuff. So what happens is they get tax credits that they then sell to investors. And for the most part, a lot of that community development corporation stuff is pretty good housing. Venice Community Housing Corporation, Santa Monica Community Corporation, a Community of Friends, which is an affordable housing developer that I work with. At least I've represented them before. They do good housing. So in that sense, yes. If the city of Rancho Palos Verdes wanted to do that, I wouldn't say no. I think the reason why perhaps I was trying to be proactively defensive on that, if one can say that, is that when you hear public housing, people think of the projects. And I want to try to divorce in people's minds the ideas when you're talking about affordable housing, you're not talking about these big, horrible projects, many of which are getting torn down, and that were real disasters. But if the government wanted to do it, I think in some ways that'd be great. And if the government could do it well, it actually would probably be more efficient than the tax credit process. But of course, it would have its own inefficiencies. Just for what it's worth in terms of Houston, you're absolutely right that, one of the reasons why Houston can build more is because they don't have zoning. I think we can come up with sort of a happy medium where we relax a lot of our zoning requirements without getting rid of it entirely. The last thing in the world I want California to be like Texas in so many ways.
Me too.
No offense to your son.
Before we go on to the next question, I did want to follow up what Connie said. I was reading where because of the lack of housing being built, that now you have large institutional investors who are snapping up homes and apartments. And in 2021, they bought 29% of all single family homes in California. So they're outbidding other buyers for this lack of housing.
One of the nice things, by the way, about SB 9 is when it talks about the lot split is that it says you have to have lived there beforehand and you have to commit to living there for another 3 years. So it's an attempt to get away from that kind of speculative stuff.
Mm-hmm. But it is going on.
Oh,
right?
yeah, it's going on.
Okay, we'll go to Lori.
Hi there, thank you. I used to work with Ronson over at the South Bay COG and appreciate the presentation. Just a couple of comments. One, I'm a huge proponent of home sharing, especially for older adults. There's a lot of big properties in Palos Verdes and people that are, cash poor and one person living in a big house. However, it doesn't help you meet your RENA numbers, but it is a great opportunity to help seniors. As far as housing, you showed some great pictures of duplexes. Some of those properties were rather large. You could have put, 4 units, smaller units. Okay. And unfortunately, we have to build up. And people don't want their view blocked. And I get that. But we need to look at that. And then I saw Ronson put a comment. Got to be some regulations on these Airbnbs, the big money coming in, basically turning them into hotels. And that's taking away a lot of housing opportunities. And I don't know if there can be some changes to some of the municipal codes to kind of slow that down, or maybe that's already in place. But definitely, I think we need to relook at the type of housing we're building. And I know people say, well, if we build these smaller units, it's going to affect my property value. At some point, something has to give. But those were my comments, and I appreciate your presentation, Jonathan. Thank you.
Just a couple of things on that. In terms of the Airbnbs, I believe that the city of Los Angeles has been cracking down on them a lot. I'm not exactly sure the process of that. I should know. For what it's worth, in terms of the people who love cracking down on Airbnbs and will be all over you like white on rice, as the expression goes, to crack down on Airbnbs are the unions, because hotels are unionized and Airbnbs are not. And so they very much want to get rid of Airbnb as much as possible.
The city of LA doesn't have enough staffing to do the oversight. That's the problem.
It's very difficult, because the problem is if you want to do, the whole staffing issue is so difficult, because if any city wants to have more staff to do the oversight, then what happens? Somebody says, why is the government spending so much money on these clerks and these bureaucrats like you and Ronson, who are doing this, and they're lambasted for this, whereas in fact those are the people that get things done.
Agreed. Thank you.
Okay, and Song, you're next.
Hi, Anne. We met at the Natural Disaster Expo a couple of weeks ago. It's so good to see you here. And speaking of that expo, I was really surprised to discover that insurability was becoming more of an issue on the peninsula. And that made me think about the broader trend of climate change and the recent natural disaster state of emergency that's been declared there on the peninsula. And I started to kind of think about, okay, so there's a similarity here between the peninsula and Florida, or parts of Florida, or a growing similarity. And I don't know if you saw the New York Times article that came out recently, maybe it was about a month ago. And it said, and so obviously there are no hurricanes, but we've got land movement here. And it says, if hurricane rebuilding is affordable only for the wealthy, this is the Florida you get. And then they wrote, what will go up are apparently second homes and luxury resorts that can turn a profit in a few years before another hurricane hits. So I'm just using the hurricane as an analogy for land movement and other kinds of climate change impacts. And so are we looking at the potential for what's happening there? And I can't remember what community that was in Florida, but I'll put the article in the chat here.
Wasn't there
And
wasn't there a huge land subsidence in Rancho Palos Verdes a few months ago that
Yes.
became a big issue?
Yes, RPV.
Yeah.
And also we have it, I mean, we've had it near Portuguese Bend, but then they had it at the top of the hill.
It was
Yeah.
Rolling Hills Estates.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rolling Hills Estate.
But it's
Adjacent.
impossible to tell the difference between the two. They're two cities are like that. So
RPV is
right,
big.
but there's also a state of emergency declared for Portuguese Bend. Yes, and there was the 12 homes that were
Red
still
tag.
falling, I believe. Yeah.
Right.
So it's just there's a broader trend pushing against affordability, right? In areas like PV and areas like Florida, but that are being impacted by climate.
Yeah, it's the phrase now that I keep hearing is managed retreat. That a lot of people who live on the coast are going to have to be pulling back from the coast because of sea level rise. And sometimes these things are very, very difficult because you have people who been living there for a long time and they want to put up a seawall, and the Coastal Commission has to tell them, nah, you can't really put up a seawall. That's not really going to do it. And so I think that, well, think about it this way: is that if you build some affordable housing 1 mile in from the coast, in a few years it'll be beachfront property.
Just to follow up on what Song said, we were at Representative Al Mertucci's town hall, which had to do with disaster. How do you respond to disasters? So one of the things that came up and a lot of people say we're in a very fire prone area. So how do you do development in a fire prone area?
Well, I think that was one of the issues that the HCD said when it was writing to RPV back in 2022 concerning the ADU ordinance. And they're saying, look, you got to do better than this. Yes, we understand that you're in a very high fire zone area, but you got to show us what it is about this development that is going to impact the high fire zone area. What if you can that there has been a tendency, at least according to HCD, to say, oh, fire zone area, we can't develop anymore. And I think we're going to have to be in the position of being a little bit more, we're going to have to work with a scalpel a little bit more to say, okay, these areas you can, these areas you can't. Because, for example, in some places, you would never want to develop in a high fire zone area because you need ingress and egress.
That's exactly what came up.
Right. But sometimes you could do an ADU or a duplex and it wouldn't affect the ingress or the egress at all. So it's going to require, more and better data as to exactly where it would be. Oh, that's interesting. From Ronson about the commercial residential. That's what it's going to have to be. Okay. Why is this area, we may need to create a new category: developable high fire zone and non-developable high fire zone.
I have a follow-up.
I'm sorry.
So I'm wondering, I apologize. Just how do you really distinguish that when previous models don't seem to be holding up? Not weather-related models aren't holding. A lot are, because fire activity has become so unpredictable. Right. So how do you go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, how do you do it? You do it with great difficulty. You can be in the position, you could be in the position of just saying, oops, it's a high fire zone area, so we can't build anywhere else. But what that then will mean is you're going to be in the position of saying huge, vast swaths of Southern California are just not going to be buildable. And then you're going to be increasing your affordability problem. So one of the big issues has to do with just ingress and egress. Let's assume that this is high fire zone. If we put another unit on this lot, how would that affect ingress and egress? That would be more of a traffic and fire safety thing on a particular lot. It'll have to be lot by lot as opposed to generally. I think that's the only way to do it. In terms of all of these models. This happens so much with all of these models. The joke in the transportation field is, how do you know you're going to get a certain amount of ridership or it's going to be a certain amount of congestion? Well, you torture the models until they confess. And the point is to say, all right, here's this street. Can you put another unit on how many lots in this place? Could you put extra units to not affect the egress? And that'll be more expensive. That does add costs. It's one of these costs of climate change that will continue to happen.
Okay, so let's go on to Wally, also of the COG.
Yes, also of the COG. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Jonathan, for a really provocative and terrific presentation. I think anything in the public where we discuss housing is a really valuable discussion. and I also want to recognize my friends, Lori and Ronson. They're both seriously committed people and top-notch professionals. And so it's just a pleasure to work with them. And Ronson and I have been sort of going back and forth a little bit on this, and I owe you a response to your email. So I'll get to it, I hope, next week. Anyway, I took a lot of notes, and I want to put out, I guess, a dissenting proposition, which is that there are those in the state, and I think Jonathan's presentation was very articulate in support of it, is that it's a supply side solution to rent, to costs. And I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that it is. I don't know whether there is or isn't, but I'll just provide some different sort of perspective on it. For one thing, I've never seen anyone in all the materials I've read come out of HCD and other agencies of the state that tells me how many units are necessary to drive the rents down on average. And so it's kind of this kind of bottomless argument that just build, baby, build, and we'll get there. But I think if you can't tell me what the market's going to do, then I'm not sure that's what I want to do. Now, Anne just mentioned a minute ago the idea of corporate ownership. And we know that at one time, housing values were a balance between the people who lived in that housing market and what they were paid, so that you could afford what was there because of what you made. But with corporate ownership, and Ronson points out ADUs, which are off the market, and very high, people who work in the technology industry who are making tremendous amounts of money compared to the average person. This kind of results in this increase because they can pay higher rates. They do pay higher rates. There's also the kind of an anomaly that there are very few, and I know that the presentation mentioned some that don't have as much homelessness and so forth, but it is a case that we just simply have too much money in this market in every city. I'm right now sitting in Bellingham, Washington, and we have homelessness here. We have high rates here. We have a affordability crisis. And so how do you get to what's, quote, affordable when it's in all over, it's happening all over at once? Why would that be? Well, international investment, corporate investment, very high wage folks are sort of what the problem is. Now, the state has a program called the Regional Early Action Program, and it put a ton of money, $250 million in REAP 1 and $600 million more coming in REAP 2, that paid us to give us the money to go out and hire some experts and take a look. So one of the things we put money into was the ADU market, and we had 6 cities. Rancho Palos Verdes was one of them. And I know they're really desperate up there to take a look at what they could do with duplexes and ADUs and so forth. And our research has come back and said there's no affordability answer there. The average rents that are getting for 80, first off, half of them are not rented. And they're used for a home office or families that come to town for just more space. In the other half, the rents are really high. So in terms of looking at ADUs as a potential to affordable housing, it's not unlikely. I also did a white paper recently from the climate perspective, and I took a look at the number, if we meet our RENA numbers, the number of vehicles that will be added to the road. And so the answer to the duplex issue, and by the way, I used to live in Carthay Center, and I lived in a duplex, and I lived upstairs, and it was wonderful. It was a 30s building. It was really high quality construction. They're getting torn down for claptrap 8 and 10 unit apartment buildings. So it's overall a loss in quality, even though we're gaining more dwelling units. But at a time in the next 6 years, from what I understand, we have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half in 6 years, or we'll be at tipping points. The idea of adding more vehicles is insane. And we need to reduce by 50%. If all of that stuff is built, that our RENA numbers are, we're going to add greenhouse gases by 25%. So there's this conflict going on between growth and the environment. Well, one of the mainstays of state mandates is that if you build near a transit, that's fine, because that'll take care of the zero emission mobility. Problem is the mode share of transit in the South Bay is 2.8%. So that's not a very effective argument here. Public transit does not play much of a role in the South Bay. So the bigger picture, of course, is a growth lobby in Sacramento that involves Tony Atkins and Scott Wiener from Senator Scott Wiener, and Governor Newsom signs this stuff. And so a political issue would be to be careful and to lobby for people who want to return local control over land use, because that's what this is about at the end of the day, is the state taking over local control.
Can I just, and can I don't know.
Yeah, please, this is dialogue. I don't mean to be a monologue.
Yeah, just a few things about this. The difficulty is, I mean, if you do more duplexes or ADUs, even if they in and of themselves are not affordable, they may regionally reduce pressure so that other places might be more affordable. So it's not particularly one place or another. I also take the point about the greenhouse gases. That's a huge issue, but there are a couple of things to say about that. One is, well, first of all, we may get bailed out by electric cars. I'm not sure that we will, but I think we may be able to do a lot of that, so there won't be as many emissions. But remember, if you don't build it, what's going to happen is people move to Lancaster and Palmdale or Chino Hills. And so you might actually get more greenhouse gases if you don't build close by. If you don't build close by so that the teacher's assistant has to drive in from South Orange County, you're actually going to be increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So in other words, you have to do a whole life cycle around it. I don't know what to say other than it's not that the state has been building a lot. It just hasn't. It's only recently that there's been stuff coming from the state. And the reason why there's stuff coming from the state is because the local governments are refusing to do it. The first state Supreme Court case that said local governments have to plan for regional needs was a case called the Association of Builders, the California Building Industry Association, not a surprise, they're the ones that want it, versus City of Livermore. And that case was in 1976. And for the next 40 years, the state begged and pleaded with local governments, do more of this. And local governments said no. And the reason why they said no is because they don't have the political incentive to do it. That's why the state's taking over with this. That's why all of this is happening. It's the local government's refusal to do it. We all want local control. I would much rather have local control. I don't want Sacramento telling me what to do. So, the idea behind the housing element is you got to build this number of units. We're not going to tell you how to do it. But we're still in this position where it's very difficult to do that. And so I would hope, part of the reason why I'm trying to present some of these models here today is to show you you can do it, and it's not going to screw up your town. At least I don't think so. Well, anyway, to be continued, because I think it's important what Wally is saying, because this is really where the issue is, and I would hope that we could get to the position where people in RPV and the Palos Verdes cities could actually be being a little more proactive on this, so you don't have Sacramento, San Francisco always coming in, or Sacramento always coming in doing this.
Right.
How much time do we have left? I could
we
talk about
have
this forever.
we have we have till a little after 4. So
Okay, because at 4 o'clock I promised my wife I was going to go out and walk the dog.
okay, all
So
right.
maybe I should.
Let me just say in
Wait,
conclusion.
Wally, because
Yeah.
we have a couple more, and then we
Well,
can come back.
okay. I just want to say I'm speaking because I have a different perspective, and I agree with
Totally fair.
I think that I just wanted to make sure you all understood there's another way of looking at this.
Yeah.
So that's fine.
Totally
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to Kathy. You have to unmute.
Okay. 2 quick questions. One is, I'd like it if you could talk about parking. I know that's one of my concerns. I mean, I'm fine with having denser housing, but I still want to know that we can park on the streets and it's not going to start looking like some really dense cities. And then I've also heard that some cities can basically like pay off nearby cities to build denser housing. So there's a possibility that like Palos Verdes or Rancho Palos Verdes in particular might be able to pay Torrance to build in their area. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll take about the second one. All I can do is I have to freely confess I have not heard of that. That is, at least not in California. That has been the case in New Jersey. There was a thing called the Mount Laurel Doctrine that said that everybody has to benefit from this. Everybody has to build more affordable housing. And so then there was and so what they changed it, and it was the Republicans who changed it to allow wealthier cities essentially to pay the poorer cities. And so what would happen is, some of the wealthy cities would pay Camden and Newark to take their affordable units. It may be doable. There may be segregation impacts to that. But there's also, if it's done right, in one sense, you could say, well, where's the land? Or as Wally said, well, maybe there might be other cities that actually have more usable land that's near transit, in which case that would be a win-win-win-win-win for everybody. But I don't know how that works in California. In terms of the parking, okay, so Ronson says you can't outsource your housing element. That's my understanding. I hadn't heard of that in California. In terms of the parking, one of the things about parking and traffic is I can just say as a general matter, the things that really generate parking and traffic impacts more than anything else are commercial spaces, not residential spaces. Because people go back and forth to commercial places a lot more, and so there's a lot more of a parking impact. The other thing, and I'm wary to say this, but I should bring it up, is the idea is, in order to reduce parking demand, one of the things you can do in certain areas is you can price it and then use the money that is priced it to go back to the community where there's an extra demand for parking. Now, why does this change anything? The reason why it changes things is because if you price it, there will be less of a demand. People go to where there is free parking. A colleague of mine named Donald Shoup wrote a famous book about 20 years ago called The High Cost of Free Parking. And he said, look, if you price parking in the right way, you actually don't have a problem with this, particularly in bigger commercial districts. It's also true, of course, with residential areas, is that if you just let the development, for the most part, if you have a residential development, the developer is going to want to have an interest in making sure that there's adequate parking in the development. Otherwise, he won't be able to sell the units. So it's not clear to me that there is as much of a parking problem. But if you price it right, it could actually be the sort of thing where you actually might have less parking demand. And then you can use that money for other kinds of community amenities that might make the community better. So if you're worried about like being like downtown, for example, or Santa Monica or something like that, and I've been there a million times, and boy, is it a pain in the neck. So I hear you on that. I think that there are ways of saying, okay, if we have more pricing, it actually can be a win-win-win on a whole lot of ways. Now that also means that we're also going to have to probably pay more to be parking. But of course, if you live somewhere, it's like in where I live. If I only have one off-street parking space, so what happens is I get a parking permit. So for people who live there, they can get a permit. Anybody else who's coming in from outside, they just pay the fee, and that goes for more amenities for the city in particular. But let me actually, I'll just put it in here. Meeting group chat. I'd suggest this is a really great way of taking a look at the parking issue. There it is. It's kind of the parking Bible. And you wouldn't think that there would be such a thing as a parking Bible, but that's it. There's a whole chapter on the history of the parking meter, and it's actually kind of interesting.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last comment. I know you have to go, but
yeah, my wife will kill me.
Yeah, and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
The last time we were trying to get Jonathan, his daughter was having a birthday as well, so she was going to kill him. So everyone, I feel sorry for his family here. But anyway, this has to do with Proposition 13, how perhaps not to throw a wedge here, but so that disincentivized development. It slowed down development because there was an incentive to stay in your single family home.
Yeah, that's right.
Because of the taxes. And so local cities were more incentivized to do retail versus even single family homes, if not multifamily homes. And so I was wondering how that factors into your presentation with where we're going, because we did try to change Prop 13.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that did slow down the rates of housing turnover, and probably makes housing more expensive because there are going to be less units on the market. But I would not say that. Well, let's put it this way: I would not want to be the politician who runs on a repeal Proposition 13 platform.
Well, they weren't repealing it; they were keeping it. They were just repealing it for the commercial. I mean,
yeah. Well, you mean for commercial and industrial? Yeah, that could be. But and it came close. They got 49%, and I think that would be a wise thing to do. But I don't think in and of itself that'll fix it.
Yeah. And I did I just wanted to give kudos to Lori's comment, because I do know a number of people who are staying, who, and matter of fact, they're encouraged to stay in their home. I just went to a Peninsula Village meeting. So there's encouragement for people to stay in their home versus to go to assisted living or some other type of housing as they grow older, as they age. And so they were encouraging them to take on a student or someone in their house, to give them housing. Mm-hmm. And like Lori was saying, but there's no credit for people to do that. So that I thought that was pretty interesting. If people got credit to open their maybe large single family home to someone else.
It'd be very difficult to write that into a housing.
I don't know how you would write, but I do know that's the new upside of aging kind of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for coming. We've learned a lot, and as you can see from either the comments in the chat and the discussion, that this is a very hot issue on everybody's mind.
And I'd certainly rather talk about that than the Middle East. So that's much better in any event.
And I don't know if you wanted to give any closing on that in terms
No. That's, I will talk. I can't talk about it, but good God, that's
because all the, just on that, UCLA, but a number of schools, not as much UCLA, have been in the news because of that, you know, in
We've
terms
been
of,
okay. We've been okay so far, and we'd love to keep it that way.
yeah, in terms of what even the professors and the students are
Yeah.
being chastised about. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
All right.